September 17th, 1862 was the bloodiest day in American history. How did we get to that point? We must first go back and look to the Battle of Seven Pines. During that battle, Confederate Commander Joseph Johnston was severely wounded. President Jefferson Davis named his military advisor to take command of the army. That man was one Robert Edward Lee, and it would be his first field command. Lee took command on June the 2nd of 1862 and immediately rechristened the Confederate Army the Army of Northern Virginia. He then formulated an offensive. This offensive resulted in battles at Oak Grove, Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Savage Station, Glendale, and Malvern Hill. This was known as the 7 Days Battles, which occurred from June the 25th until July the 1st. These battles drove the Union forces from the outskirts of Richmond. Following a decisive victory in the Battle of Second Manassas, Lee was determined to take the fight to the north. This resulted in the Maryland Campaign. The battle everybody remembers as synonymous with Maryland Campaign is Antietam. However, that was not the only battle. Battles also occurred at South Mountain and Harpers Ferry, both of which occurred before Antietam, and the Battle of Shepherdstown, which occurred immediately after. Lee never intended to fight a battle at Sharpsburg. Lee had his eye on Pennsylvania and the rich Pennsylvania heartland. Here he could feed his army, he could relieve the beleaguered farmers of the Shenandoah Valley. With the Union Army very disorganized, he would like to force a federal response, and he wanted to play the political card. Coming up in November were the midterm elections. For the first time in history, Republicans controlled the House of Delegates. The houses where all appropriations bills originate. Lee figured with an army in northern Pennsylvania, voters would be encouraged to vote for the Democrats. With the Republicans out of office and out of control, the Democrats could possibly refuse to fund the war and bring the war to an end. There was also thought of foreign intervention, and indeed, many in the South hoped for that intervention. Lee himself, in none of his correspondence, did he ever mention that was one of his intents. So the campaign begins on September 4th, 1862, as the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River. They advanced unchecked to Frederick. A battle at Harpers Ferry was also not a part of Lee's plans. Lee expected that the garrisons at Harpers Ferry and Martinsburg would be withdrawn. Lee was wrong. Colonel Dixon Miles was in command of the garrison at Harpers Ferry. The last order he received before the telegraph lines were cut told him to not abandon Harpers Ferry. Now Lee was in a quandary. There was a federal force to his rear at Harpers Ferry. He knew that he must deal with that force before proceeding. Thus, he issued Special Orders 191, perhaps the most complex orders he issued during the entire war. These orders were also known as the Lost Orders. They were the orders found by a pair of Union soldiers wrapped around 3 cigars. As they delivered this to McClellan, McClellan now knew where each part of Lee's army was located. Lee's plan called for dividing the army into 4 parts. 3 columns, comprising approximately 2/3 of his army, and under the overall command of General Thomas Jackson, were ordered to move on Harpers Ferry. Lee's orders called for General Lafayette McLaws to take Maryland Heights. General John Walker was to take Loudon Heights, and Jackson himself would take Bolivar Heights. Those were the 3 heights surrounding Harpers Ferry. Lee, with Longstreet's command, would move to Hagerstown, which would be the rendezvous point for Jackson's force that was sent to capture Harpers Ferry. Hagerstown would then be the springboard for the invasion of Pennsylvania. Colonel Miles began preparations for the defense of Harpers Ferry on September the 8th. Miles had done very little to fortify the heights, despite receiving orders to do so. Major General John Wool had previously instructed Colonel Miles to build a blockhouse on Maryland Heights, to construct entrenchments on Bolivar Heights, and to lay abatis on Camp Hill. These orders were never acted upon, although Miles did construct a naval battery partway up Maryland Heights. Today you can reach that battery, but you better be in darn good shape to get there. Miles also placed entrenchments on Camp Hill, but that was it. Meanwhile, in Martinsburg, General Julius White was in command of the garrison at Martinsburg with his 2,500 troops. He retreated to Harpers Ferry after abandoning Martinsburg. The Harpers Ferry garrison now numbered 14,000 troops. White ceded command of the garrison to Colonel Miles. Miles assigned Colonel Thomas H. Ford to command Maryland Heights. When Ford arrived on the heights, he found there were no fortifications. He twice requested artillery so his troops could command the position, but was overruled each time by Colonel Miles. On September the 11th, McLaws' men, nearing their hastily constructed fortifications, drove in the federal pickets. There was going to be a fight, and it was going to happen soon. In his report, Ford said, during the night, both armies slept on their arms within speaking distance of each other, and certainly not more than 100 yards apart. The fighting began in earnest at 6:30 a.m. After a few hours of heavy fighting, the Federals were driven back to their hastily constructed breastworks. At that point, Colonel Eliakim Sherrill, commander of the 126th New York Infantry, was wounded. His troops were fairly green, and when they saw him being carried from the field, many began to panic, and many fled from the field. Federal troops continued fighting through the afternoon, but they were soon overwhelmed by the veteran troops of William Barksdale and Joseph Kershaw. Barksdale on the left, Kershaw on the right. The Federals had no choice but to retreat. With Confederates advancing at his front and believing his left was about to be flanked, Ford ordered the guns to be spiked and dismounted and thrown into the ravine. They then retreated down the mountain and crossed the pontoon bridge into Harpers Ferry. The only problem was that his orders were never followed. Now McLaws was free to place his artillery atop Maryland Heights. And as you can see here, This is the remains of the pontoon bridge. This was the Maryland side. The troops came down, crossed the pontoon bridge, and into the armory grounds at Harpers Ferry. Again, with Maryland Heights under Confederate control, McLaws placed his artillery. Jackson was 3 miles from Bolivar Heights, approaching to Schoolhouse Ridge. Walker found Loudon Heights unoccupied and easily placed his guns there. Miles was surrounded on all sides, but he refused to surrender. He had an ace up his sleeve. As he is defending Bolivar Heights right here, and Jackson is here on Schoolhouse Ridge. Bolivar Heights was 200 feet higher than Schoolhouse Ridge. Miles had the high ground. That was a distinct advantage. Meanwhile, Lee had another predicament. He had sent D.H. Hill to defend the gaps at South Mountain. Those gaps, Fox's Gap, Turner's Gap, and Crampton's Gap. Fox's Gap is where 9th Corps Commander Jesse Reno of Wheeling, Virginia, was killed. McClellan's forces broke through those gaps. Now, Lee not only has a force behind him, not knowing what's going on at Harpers Ferry, he also has a force in front of him as McClellan is heading for Sharpsburg. On September 14th, Jackson ordered his guns on Maryland Heights and Loudon Heights to open fire. Despite the constant shelling, Miles still refused to surrender. At this point, Jackson realized he must attack. He planned a nighttime assault, a frontal assault, uphill across open ground. Many said Jackson was crazy. He was crazy, all right, but he was crazy like a fox, because that movement would be a diversion. The real movement would come from A.P. Hill. Jackson was very familiar with the land and terrain around Harpers Ferry. He had his first command in 1861 had been at Harpers Ferry. He knew the ground. He knew that there was a farm that was behind Bolivar Heights. So he sent Hill on the southward trajectory down to the Shenandoah River. Hill would march up the river and reach this area here, which would be Murphy's Farm. Now that would put A.P. Hill behind Miles. At the same time, Jackson ordered 10 guns to be redeployed to the base of Loudon Heights, right across the river. At that point, Jackson was very confident. He sent a message to Lee, informing Lee that Harpers Ferry would fall in the morning. Lee would immediately send a message back for Jackson to get to Sharpsburg and go behind Antietam Creek where Lee awaited him. Also on the evening of September 14th, Union cavalry under Colonel Benjamin Davis made a breakout attempt. Under cover of darkness, 1,500 men were able to cross the Potomac undetected via the pontoon bridge and escape into Maryland, hoping to find help. They never did find help, but they did manage to capture 91 Confederate ammunition supply wagons. As the morning of the 15th dawned, there was a heavy fog. As the fog lifted, this is what Colonel Miles saw. Now A.P. Hill was behind him. Jackson was in front of him. He was surrounded on all sides. As the fog cleared, the Confederate guns opened fire. Surrounded, outnumbered, and out of long-range artillery ammunition, Miles saw no other choice. He called a council of war with his brigade commanders, and the decision was made to surrender Harpers Ferry. As the white flag went up, one of the last Confederate volleys landed near Miles and mortally wounded him. General White then assumed command. Jackson immediately left to meet Lee behind Antietam Creek, leaving A.P. Hill to accept a surrender of over 12,000 men. Of course, Brigadier General White surrendered the garrison. The Federals were granted liberal terms. The officers and men were paroled. The officers could keep their sidearms. Wagons were even loaned so the officers could take their personal belongings with them. Once that task was accomplished, Hill's division headed for Sharpsburg, just in time to save the Army of Northern Virginia from certain disaster. On September the 18th, the day after the Battle of Antietam, each side was left licking its wounds. Lee, not liking his position with the river to his rear, decided on a movement back to Virginia. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Lee slipped away from Sharpsburg and headed for the crossing near Shepherdstown called Boteler's Ford. This, however, was not a retreat. Lee fully intended to continue the campaign, as he indicated in a message to President Jefferson Davis. After crossing, Lee intended to move upriver and recross into Maryland at Williamsport. To secure this crossing, Lee sent Jeb Stuart and his cavalry on to Williamsport. Meanwhile, the Federals woke up to find the Confederates gone. Where were they? The cavalry was sent to investigate, so there was a pursuit. However, the cavalry was under orders to not cross the Potomac unless great damage could be inflicted upon the enemy without loss. Upon reaching the Potomac, however, the cavalry found that the very end of Lee's army had just crossed the ford. At that point, Confederate batteries opened fire. William Pendleton, assigned to defend the ford, was Lee's head of artillery. He had 44 guns at his disposal, along with the brigades of Lewis Armstead and Alexander Lawton. However, after Antietam, those brigades only brought 600 effectives to the field. Again, there was a pursuit, and that was accomplished by Fitzjohn Porter and the 5th Corps. Throughout the afternoon of the 19th, elements of the 5th Corps, commanded by General Porter, arrived and took up positions on the Maryland side of the Potomac. Pendleton had never before commanded infantry. Fearing flanking movements, he sent men to protect each flank. This left him with only 300 to defend the ford. The 1st U.S. sharpshooters under Captain John Eisler advanced across the ford, while the 4th Michigan provided covering fire, after which the 4th Michigan crossed. With all these troops coming across the ford, the Confederates ran in confusion, and 4 guns were captured. Pendleton left looking for help. He finally found Lee around midnight and told him that he had lost all of his guns. Lee said all of them, and Pendleton said yes. In reality, he had only lost 4. Upon hearing this false information, Lee stopped the movement towards Williamsport. He ordered A.P. Hill to return to Shepherdstown to retake the ford. In the meantime, the Federals had recrossed the ford and returned to the Maryland side. On September the 20th, Porter ordered a reconnaissance in force. 4 brigades under Major Charles Lovell crossed the ford. The orders were to advance, determine the enemy force, and fall back. Porter did not want a general engagement. At this point, we have to give McClellan a little bit of credit here. Anticipating Lee, McClellan sent Alfred Pleasonton with half his cavalry to the nearest crossing upriver from Shepherdstown at Williamsport. He also sent most of the Union 6th Corps, around 11,000 men, to that crossing as well. One thing was for sure: Lee was not going to cross at Williamsport. Now Lovell, on his recon in force, encounters A.P. Hill not a mile into his journey. Lovell deploys his troops and falls back to the bluffs. Colonel James Barnes' brigade at the time was marching toward Shepherdstown. Barnes' brigade was ordered to return to cover Lovell's right flank as he withdrew. General Gouverneur Warren's brigade crossed the ford and deployed on Lovell's left. Confederate General Pender feared he would be flanked. Here's Pender's position. He called for reinforcements. 3 brigades under General James Archer immediately came to his aid. Now it seems like all heck is going to break loose. Porter did not want an engagement. This was a reconnaissance in force. General Porter ordered an immediate withdrawal. Lovell's brigade and Warren's brigade immediately retreated and recrossed the ford, as did most of Colonel Barnes' brigade. Only the 118th Pennsylvania Regiment remained. That Green Regiment had been in the Army for only about 3 weeks and was commanded by Colonel Charles Prevost. Prevost refused the order to withdraw because it had not come through the proper channels. This regiment had served in a reserve role at Antietam. They had not seen any action up to this point. The 118th Pennsylvania had a decision to make. Did they surrender? Did they fight? Or did they retreat? Those who chose to fight found that their Enfield rifles did not work. Panic ensued. The men ran to the bluffs and tumbled down the hillside, as you can see here, as the Confederates unleashed volley after volley. The 118th had brought 737 men to the field. The regimental loss was 63 killed, 101 wounded, and 105 missing or captured. The 269 casualties, which was 37% of the regiment, accounted for 75% of all Federal casualties in the battle. A little bit about the Corn Exchange Regiment before we go on. The 118th Pennsylvania was also known as the Corn Exchange Regiment because the Philadelphia Corn Exchange had raised money for the regiment's equipment. They also provided a $10 bonus for each recruit. This regiment would go on to fight in many battles, including the Battle of Gettysburg, where a monument has been placed in their honor. The fighting ended at about 2:30 in the afternoon when the last of the Federals had crossed the river. In the face of superior artillery fire on the north side of the Potomac, the Confederates chose not to pursue. McClellan also chose not to pursue based on the size of Lee's force, which was based on mistaken information. McClellan was convinced that Lee had many more men than he actually did. The 5th Corps was kept at Butler's Ford to prevent any recrossing until late October. McClellan had succeeded in blocking Lee at 2 fords, but his inactivity was his undoing. He was soon relieved of command by President Abraham Lincoln. Lee also chose to abandon any plans he may have had to resume his invasion. Instead, he withdrew farther south to Winchester, and the Maryland campaign was over. A little bit about Shepherdstown before we finish here. Shepherdstown was one big hospital. The town had southern leanings, which was good for the Confederate wounded. Shepherdstown was far enough behind Confederate lines that the Federals could not reach them. It was also close enough to the front, affording transportation logistics. It was easy to get to, based on Butler's Ford and also the roads leading into and out of Shepherdstown. Wounded had started trickling into Shepherdstown after the battles of South Mountain. By midnight of September the 17th, Shepherdstown was one huge hospital. Hospital flags were run up most of the town's buildings. By morning of the 19th, every inch of space was occupied. Federal guns were not aimed at the town itself, but in their pursuit on the 19th and 20th, cannons were booming. They were aimed at the Confederate Army, which was moving beyond the town. However, some would fall short, and the town and wounded were shelled. For days and weeks and months, the town was caught between two hostile armies while hosting many wounded soldiers. The Maryland campaign resulted in an inordinate amount of casualties. The chief battle again being the Battle of Antietam. Most of the wounded and killed resulted from the Battle of Antietam, while most of the missing and captured resulted from the Battle of Harpers Ferry, which had all 12,000 Federal troops captured. Lee never intended to fight at Antietam. If not for the Battle of Harpers Ferry, Antietam could possibly have never happened. He would have continued into Pennsylvania, and from there, it's anybody's guess as to what would have occurred.